Kia ora koutou. Ngā mihi nui, ko Jonathan Kennedy toku ingoa. He rata whānau ahau I whare wānanga o Otago ki Poneke, the University of Otago, Wellington. I'm also a general practitioner at Newtown Union Health Service, where we see many people with a refugee and migrant background. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today at Victoria University, and special thanks to Associate Professor Sarah Kindon, who has been a key organiser for this talk. I acknowledge Te Atiawa, Ngāti Toa, Taranaki Whānui, Ngā Mana Whenua, or Tēnei Rohe. So firstly, a few words about health and safety. The evacuation route is via the exit at the main entry door or the back exit, and we should assemble on the footpath of Stout Street. The instructions for an earthquake remain as usual to drop, cover and hold, and then wait till it finishes before we go out. And the amenities are around the corner here. I should speak from experience and say watch out for the dangerous taps if you turn them on too hard. They're pretty powerful. Right, so please also put your cell phones on silent to respect Alison's time and energy. And I'd like to just give you a heads up that this lecture is being publicly recorded. So this is the 8th and final talk of the prestigious Dakal Distinguished Lectureship Series, which was awarded to the University of Otago Centre for Global Migrations to fund an extensive visit to New Zealand by Professor Alison Phipps. The Dakal series of talks is designed to promote and to encourage learning among a wide audience, and we are delighted that Victoria University of Wellington is co-hosting this event with us as we all make the most of having Alison visit us in Wellington. Thank you, Alison. Alison comes to us returning to Wellington, as she said, not a stranger. You lovely people keep inviting me back. Here now as the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts, and Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies at the University of Glasgow. This is the first time that Alison and I have met, but I can already appreciate why we collectively keep inviting her back. All here likely have a shared interest with her in the well-being and health of people forced to move from their homes and travel far to new lives. More personally, Alison has taken politicians to witness refugees in the Calais refugee camp with Médecins Sans Frontières, an organisation I belong to. And we found a shared belief that one does not have to have an either-or mentality when considering health service provision, and welcome and support using society, respect for languages and the power of the arts. We're also extremely lucky to have her here, as I found out today, because she's sort of on strike. All her colleagues are out in -8 degrees on strike as part of an academic protest back in Glasgow. But apparently if you're on an international trip, you don't have to strike. So we're very lucky. Alison described herself to me as a poet of lament, but I already hear so much more. Performer, distinguished academic, and I especially like a colleague's description of her as an activist scholar. I think we all look forward to hearing her speak today. Alison is intending to speak until about 6:30, and then we have another 25 minutes allocated for questions and discussion before we wrap up. There may be a bit of flexibility with how those times are used. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, Alison.
Kia ora, Jonathan. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou kato. And thank you to the Dakal Lecture Series, particularly my colleague, Professor Angela McCarthy, sitting at the back, and also others in the Centre for Global Migrations, to Jonathan and to Professor Sarah Kindon and her team here at Victoria University, Wellington, for hosting me and inviting me back again. And it's lovely seeing some familiar faces and people I've seen in other places around the country. I come to you today from Ōtepoti, Dunedin, on a flight which was relocating a Syrian family who I've come to know in Hamilton, where they assure me it will be warmer, and where the people sitting next to me were complaining in loud voices about the fact that there were refugees on the plane and they shouldn't be allowed because they were taking space up in the overhead lockers that they wanted. And I was greeted here at the airport by an Ethiopian who spoke to me in Amharic and in Tigrinya and who talked to me passionately and with pride about the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, his recent winning of the Nobel Peace Prize, and our joint love of politics, peace building, and injera, that great Ethiopian pancake. And I bring you greetings from the snow-capped mountains of Ben Lomond and the Red Clyde, where, as Jonathan said, we're on strike again. And I do so as someone coming from a family that is half refugee and made up of people through history who were cleared from the land. I'd also just like to acknowledge tangata whenua and mihi particularly to Picky Diamond and Herowina Easton, who have given me some lovely pointers as I've been learning about aspects of Te Reo Māori as part of my time here. So as Jonathan said, we're on strike in the UK at the moment, and thankfully I'm not, because when you travel overseas, you don't have to be on strike. But also wanted to let you know that everything I say today, I have to say without acknowledging funders in the UK, because we're presently in a time of purdah, as we call it, a very odd term for us to use, but it means that any public academic or public servant is not actually allowed to mention where they get their public funds from, because it might turn the result of the election. If only. If only. But I also come to you at this time, at a time worldwide where we know that once again, by many, fascism is desired, and that is what we have to explain, where we see hearts breaking and broken daily with the tragedies that are unfolding on borders around the world. And we see, particularly amongst our young people, a renewal of energy around protest, particularly around climate action and the refugees welcome movement, but also a renewal of what we might call the decolonial task that was very much part and parcel of the work of the 1940s and 50s and 60s, but is very strong again on campuses, and which I think is relevant to the questions of well-being that are part of what I want to talk to you about today. In her beautiful one-woman play, the singer-songwriter Corinne Polwart writes this about the well-being of the geese. She says, in September, the geese snake in across the Firth of Forth from their summer nests in Iceland and the coastal cliffs of Greenland, clattering and honking in an ever-shifting skein. My garden is a flight path. I watch, I listen. The outstretched wingtips of each migrating goose creates an upwash, a pocket of wind resistance for the geese tucked in, behind and below. These nooks of ease, these aerodynamic sanctuaries, they cut the drag for all by up to 65%. It's a wonder, and it's a gale-bitten struggle to sustain cooperation. Every goose takes a turn, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Like skyborn socialists, no lone bird bears the brunt. It's a gorgeous symbiotic dance. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. Stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. But I fear for the weather to come, she says, and we're not going to make it alone. Do come in, do come in. So the well in welcome. In part of my life when I actually get to sit in libraries or with the Oxford English Dictionary online, looking at the deep detail of the etymological dictionary and the historical thesaurus, one of the things I love to do and think about is where the roots are of our words and languages. Indigenous people the world over do this and know this and hold their languages in ways where they can still see the interweaving. But we've often lost these in English. But I wanted to think today with you about the well that is in welcome. And well in the etymological dictionaries and in the historical thesauruses referred originally to a spring of water which was supposed to have miraculous origins or supernatural healing powers. A spring of water or perhaps of oil. And in its later use, maybe a mineral spring thought to have medicinal qualities that would set you up a bit like spa treatments today or sea bathing. So perhaps when we talk about welcome, we're not in the territory of the welcome strategy of the Aotearoa New Zealand government, but maybe we're in a domain of magic and mystery and the more than human world. There are other etymological roots to the word well. Well is also at the root of the Old English word wheel, from which we took wealth or commonwealth, but from which we also take will. And you can see that lovely list behind me of words that it's cognate with coming out of the Germanic roots, migrating across Europe, landing with Saxons and Vikings and all kinds of other migrants and marauders and settlers and harvesters over millennia, giving us language that we hold and use today in these root words of welcome and wellness and well-being. Wall, wella, walla, walla, wall, vel, val, vel, valla, vol. And the word welcome, when we break it open, when we look back at when it first started being used in the 13th century, when those words were beginning to be recorded and found in language, a form which is apparently, according to the Old English Dictionary, is now obsolete. Welcome meant one whose coming is pleasing or desirable, an acceptable person or an acceptable thing. And when said of a person, acceptable as a visitor or as a companion. And I think that's very interesting when we think about the riven politics of today, that this aspect of acceptability, this aspect of conditionality links into these origin words of welcome. And when we say all are welcome, somewhere underneath that, as Derrida has pointed out in his work on hospitality, we're also imposing conditions on what is acceptable to me. Like the man on the plane next to me today, what's not acceptable is that somebody might be using the luggage locker that I wanted to use. But of course, in ordinary parlance, you're welcome actually changes to mean everyone's welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome. It's just a greeting, a phrase, Americanized, but there it is. In its banality, in its sheer ordinary everydayness, everyone is welcome. A universality that it has that's transitioned out of that aspect of acceptability. And then it struck me that I was speaking today in Whanganui Atara in Wellington. And that whilst Whanganui Atara, thanks to Hiriwani and to Piki, I know, doesn't mean the harbour of the spike or the cloak, which is what Google Translate was giving me, but actually the harbour of Tara, and I got to explore the Atua and the ancestry. But in looking at Wellington, of course, we have a very different, far less mystical, elemental sense to the word, because we have a warlord, we have a general, we have a former prime minister, we have the inventor of boots, with which to trample on the watery earth. And standing here in Wellington, I'm aware that we also are very close to the seat of the new world well-being politics, like those that are coming together where two women also lead the countries in Iceland and in Scotland. The poet David Wagoner said, But the place where you stand is called home, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. And a powerful stranger may be a friend, may indeed be acceptable, and a powerful stranger may need a little caution, a little wariness, a little time to get used to and understand. And of course, this place where we stand today is complicated. It's unsettled. Its land is unsettled and riven, but its people too are unsettled. It's also a land that is settled. It's a land that is both desettling and, with refugees, it is resettling. As am I. Because my name is Alison, and in very unsettling ways to me, I am a recovering racist. I was born with this addiction because my ancestors were white, and the country I am from grew fat in every imperial fight. Money, privilege, and power come down the barrel of a gun. That wasn't just in history, it's still how this is done. The work which calls me loudly towards your skins and eyes and tears is the work which is intention to assuage those birthright fears. So do not idolize my actions. Do not praise my words as bold. Do not look at my intentions or the papers that I hold. The thoughts I have of charity are just part of this addiction inherited from a line that is a long and bleached out fiction. I do not have to worry when my skin is in a room or on a train or in a car or in the immigration tomb. I'll be given space and money and more time because I'm white, because my ancestors were slave owners or slave drivers and right. But you, my friends, my kindred, will be skinned another way, flayed into diminishments through ever greater punishments and all those cruel admonishments. The only proper meaning of a white man's burden is that for all my days commitment will be to a healing labour. On my deathbed, in my dying, I will be a racist too. But it's shouldering the burden that can lead to something new. Not denial of what sticks to every tone or shade or pore, but the making of relationships that brim with something more. Something giving and forgiving of the shame upon my skin. Something real and raw and honest that can live with history's sin. At times, our conversations may make our skins dissolved, and around us through the laughter a new world may revolve, when the tears are all that bind us, and the skin gives way to bone, and through this work we live again and call one earth our home. That's one of my approaches to the place where I stand that is a powerful stranger. And I wrote that poem on the night that the 45th President of the United States of America was elected to power on a flight from Wellington, where I had just heard the news from Mel's husband, Tim, just before I landed in Melbourne, knowing I needed to do some work because something had failed. So that's one approach to dealing with the powerful stranger. Another, of course, is policies of well-being. And don't get me wrong, I'm really excited about the shift towards speaking of well-being rather than simply monetary policy or economic contribution with regard to refugee resettlement, or actually any form of activity that might be taking place within the realm of politics and the public. Anything that might actually mean we get to live in a healthy society together. In Scotland, we are told that the strategy for the country is that we might live well and flourish, really taking on the motto of my home city of Glasgow, which is let Glasgow flourish, into a national strategy. And the question then for all the strategies in the country is how might we do this together through the organs of government and civil society in such a way that all might flourish. One of my tasks within civil society life in Scotland is to chair the New Scots integration strategy for the Scottish Government, the Refugee Council, and also for COSLA, which is the umbrella organisation for the local authorities. And then bringing together many other organisations like the Red Cross, like the health boards, the education boards, the language boards, any board you can get, a monopoly board would also do. We bring it round the table and look at it with relation to the New Scots integration strategy. The strategy is a really interesting strategy in that we believe it is the first one in the world to have been written with an eye on integration of refugees. And when we did the work to actually write the refugee integration strategy, we worked with refugees and former refugees. So in the UK, we often don't talk about refugee background. We often do talk about refugees because that is a prized status from the majority who have been asylum seekers. But everybody knows that these labels are troubled and troubling and difficult and aren't all that appropriate and can be very essentializing. So we asked people of refugee background what they wanted to be called, and they said, we want to be called New Scots. We want to be called New Scots, and we don't mind being New Scots for a long time. So as someone who's been a New Scot now for 24 years, in fact, longer than I've been a new anything else, I then get to share that label, New Scots, with those who may have come and sought sanctuary in my country. So this is a really interesting approach to integration in that it's a rights-based approach. It's rooted in the Human Rights Declaration, and every strand of the policy starts with a statement from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The right to housing, the right to education, the right to speak and nurture your mother tongue, the right to live with a way of sustaining your heritage and culture and in a community, the right to claim asylum, the right to protection, the right to employment. Each one of the strands starts from a rights-based approach and then develops into an understanding of integration from day one. So in England and Wales, the strategy is integration from when you receive your refugee status, and that can take a year, it can take 5 years, it can take 10 years. I have known it take 22 years, during which time you have no right to work, and you have, whilst you are making your claim, the right to live on £37.60 a week. No right to work, £37.60 a week. And that money is given to you on a card, and you have to spend it at certain large supermarket chains, which may well be a long bus ride away from where you have been relocated. So the New Scots integration strategy takes 7 core areas as vital. And these, again, have been identified through a way of looking at what it is that New Scots believe will make them well, will give them a way not just of feeling welcome, not just of getting over that threshold into a country and having protection, but actually being able to live in ways that mean that they can flourish too. So it's not an either or. It's not the Scots will flourish and we really need to just do what is good for those already here, but actually very much an integration strategy. And it's understood as multilateral. So the important point about this is that everyone has the task of integration upon them. Everyone, if you like, is unsettling and resettling and having to think through what that means to together make a new society. Interestingly, when we looked at the many people who submitted their information into the construction of the refugee integration strategy, 96% said the most important thing to them was that they were able to honour their culture, where they'd come from, their cultural heritage, and that they were able to navigate into the new languages that they would have to learn, but that others would learn those languages alongside them. And so within our equivalent of sponsorship programs that you have, I think, with the Red Cross, over here we have programs of sharing languages. And that when somebody might go shopping with a family, then they will be learning that this might be what we call oil, but this might be what another family calls zaytun. So that there's a mutual bit of language sharing going on. Because it's a powerful stranger language. It's a site of distrust and mistrust and misunderstanding. It's a place where fear can be raised. And so there's work going on in our language integration strategies for everyone to feel a little bit more comfortable around the language. So as you can tell, I feel quite positive about our wellbeing strategy and about our New Scots integration strategy, and that's good because it's my job to make it happen. But I'm also, as a scholar, wanting to bring a note of caution to the work we're doing around well-being. Because I do think we need vigilance, particularly coming from the arts and humanities and philosophy disciplines, that look at what might be excluded or who might be excluded in the making of our policies about well-being. Who is well-being for? Who is welcome for? And it's right that we listen hard when people say, but what about our own? And that we acknowledge the failures that have occurred in societies for many years, where certainly we within the city of Glasgow, with the worst death privation statistics and some of the worst health statistics in the whole of Europe, that we say if we are going to offer a good welcome and do resettlement and reintegration well for a group of people who are arriving, surely this is an opportunity for these ways of caring for people to be how we learn to undo the ills of the past and create a society where all are well. That this is not either or. It's not you get a house and I don't. It's not you get healthcare and I don't. It's not you get luggage space and I don't. Because there was no one whose bag who wasn't on that plane. It's about the creative act of making room. One of the wonderful things that I've seen happening in theological studies recently is the understanding of creation as a form of making room. Making room in the Christian theological tradition was the making room that was the withdrawal to give space for a Sabbath in which others could do the making themselves. Or as one wonderful theologian says, it's like the kind-faced lady on the subway who moves her bag so you can take a seat. Creative acts of making room. A bit like those nooks of ease that give you a way of labouring and resting. So I believe that vigilance is needed. And I believe there's a danger within our well-being strategies, and this is as true for the TED talk that our First Minister gave on the Wellbeing and GDP for Scotland, as I think it is for your wellbeing policies here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The emphasis on kindness and compassion is vital, and it is not sufficient because it is no substitute for justice and structural change. George MacLeod, a theologian working in the 1930s in between the wars, said when you give of your time or your money or your effort or your energy, 50% of that should be to the immediate need, to the people in need on the streets, to the people in need because of humanitarian assistance, and give it without question because you are not that person. The other 50%, why is this happening and what can you do politically and in terms of structures to affect a change? And that work is often rather like the committed people who sit around a table for 2 hours on a regular basis, giving of their time voluntarily to the New Scots integration strategy to think hard about how we change structures. And it's often really boring, unsexy, uncharitable work, but it changes things for an awful lot of people when we get it right. One change of law for one young girl who was to be deported from the UK under the European Convention, the Dublin Agreement 2A. One change of that, and thousands of people who were unaccompanied minors were saved from deportation. We may not know about it. It may be hidden in those codes, but it's incredibly important. So I think there's an ethical valence that we need to bring to questions of compassion and well-being. We need to be aware that it's compassion and well-being and kindness and keep asking the question for whom. Because if the for whom is for refugees at the expense of those who are in situations of structural inequality and the violence of poverty in our own societies, then that is not well-being, and that is not welcome. That is not acceptable. That is not companionship. The root word of companionship being those with whom we break our bread. Companion. And I think we can learn a lot from feminist and decolonial and even queer critics about justice and cultural change, beyond kindness and beyond charity, and the uncomfortable work that the majority of us benefiting from the structural violences in society will need to do to move us into a place where well-being is truly shared. We often ask the question, and I certainly have done this, the charitable question, how can we help? What can we do? And in my time here within Aotearoa, New Zealand, I've seen an awful lot of completely mind-blowingly wonderful projects done by communities and different people. The giving of vast amounts of clothing and children's toys, of time and energy, of food banks and of volunteering, to the point that it's almost too much. It's almost suffocating. And I've seen the same in my own context, where we worked out we had, for every one resettled Syrian refugee, we had 5 volunteers, all terrifyingly like my mother. And really, one is quite enough. Podrick Otuma says of questions like, how can we help? Moo, he says, drawing on Fierzik Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance. He says, it's not a good question. How can I help? Unask the question. Ask better questions. Lila Watson, the great Aboriginal activist, said, if you've come here to help, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because you believe that your liberation, your freedom from structural violence is tied up with mine, is bound up with my struggle, then we can work together. And that is where I have seen time and again communities living in poverty who are host communities coming together with refugee resettled communities and improving everything. Tower blocks that were scheduled for demolition in Glasgow are now thriving because the migrant communities have got together with the local communities, and the mould is gone, and there are gardens, and there are drying greens, and there are play parks. Because people didn't say, why have you got one and I haven't? People said, if we work together, there are twice as many of us to actually make a difference. There's a word for this kind of philosophizing that I'm doing that comes from thinkers like Laurent Berlant and also Sarah Ahmed. Laurent Berlant has a book called Cruel Optimism. And she basically says that we need to be careful about the relationship of attachment we have to compromised conditions of possibility, whose realization is discovered to be either impossible, sheer fantasy, or too possible and toxic. She says this is often true about campaigns around dieting, which will say, if you do this, everything will work and you will have this particular figure. But actually it's cruel optimism, because you won't get there that way. And she really asks us to be careful of the positions we inhabit, not to be unduly optimistic, to have a lot of pragmatism, like I've found today in my colleague Jonathan, and that I've found as an activist is vital to the work we do. So that what we imagine to be the perfect life, the flourishing life, the good life, that we remember that for many that may actually be a bad life. And every time someone says to me, make sure you do a bit of self-care, just a wee glass of wine, put your feet up, have a spa, I'm reminded of the conditions of inequality that will rest on, the labouring that goes on in vineyards that is cruel and unjust, under which I might be able to enjoy something that has come a very long way and is trashing the planet. Another approach to well-being is the European approach. The European approach to welcome, the European directive on welcome and well-being is, I believe, particularly pernicious at this moment. Frontex polices the borders of Europe, and we have even more stringent controls in the UK. And this is it. So in 2003, a boat sank off the coast of Lampedusa, and around, we believe, 398 people, the majority of them Eritreans, lost their lives. In those coffins are the bodies of those who lost their lives. They were posthumously granted refugee status. Had they come alive, they would have had years to go through a labyrinthine system like the one I described to you of seeking asylum. And in one of those coffins is a member of my own family, my whānau. This is what has been called by Achille Mbembe, the great post-colonial scholar, necropolitics, and what I also call necroethics, because there is an ethical system that justifies this. It's the one I was next to on the plane today. In order that I might have the room I believe is due to me, you should not have that room. You should not be on this plane. You should not have the right to freedom of movement within a country. Necroethics is what has been described in my country as the ethic of the garden fork. Described as children playing in a garden, and they kick a ball over the fence. And when that ball goes over the fence into their neighbour's garden, the neighbour has a choice. The neighbour can either go round with the football and maybe a cup of tea and some lollies and join in, or the neighbour can put a fork through the football and complain that their roses have been bashed. That's necroethics, a politics of death, an ethics of death, a killing of joy in a very particular and quite pernicious way, and one which is easily exacerbated. When I visited the Calais camps that Jonathan mentioned, it was at the time when the daffodils were blooming. For the first time, the daffodils did not bring me cheerfulness. Their nodding yellow heads, incongruent, stubborn, sunshine at the wrong end of winter. It was wartime. The earth struggles against the seed corn. The ploughed fields may or may not bring harvest. On the cliff tops, there are old gun emplacements looking across the estuary towards the nuclear power plants. Around their concrete bases, the same jaundiced flowers, spring's heralds or signs of I fear. I do not know whether to fight or to flee. I do not know if the east wind will spread the pollen or freeze away the first signs of life. On the borders of Europe, they are loading people into cages and sending them back to the bombs. And on the borders of this field, there are daffodils nodding away as the bodies wash again out to sea. So now that you're all suitably depressed, let's look at some of the joyful ways in which we can enact welcome in a way that is well for all, that sense of vol, as well as a source that seems to be bubbling over with joy. So welcome to Refuwigi. If you come from Glasgow, you're called a Ouija. A Glaswegian is a Ouija. And Refuwigi just says that everyone's a Refuwigi. A Refuwigi is a person who, upon arrival in Glasgow, is embraced either by birth or by arrival by train or boat or plane or however, is embraced by the people of the city, a person considered to be local. See also Glaswegian. We're all for somewhere, it says in Scots. And I'm wearing the Refuwigi wristbands here. One of the things Refuwigi has done, as well as collecting up the things that people need, like children's buggies or sanitary protection for young girls, is invite the locals to write letters of welcome to those who are arriving. Letters for the locals, as it's known. And here are some of the wonderful examples. And there are hundreds of these that are given to people in welcome packs when they arrive in the city. And they're lovely, full of tips about how to make yourself feel good. Like, you'll want to go to the parks, but maybe not when it's raining. You can go to the city centre for shopping. You can go to the museum to visit because it's free. And you'll want to go to the Lidl supermarket because it's really cheap. It's a very big city, but the people are very good. This simple language of welcome from young children. And here are two of the people leading some of the refugee integration work, two refugee ambassadors for the Scottish Refugee Council and our UNESCO programme, leading the welcome events that the Scottish Refugee Council does. Refugee-led welcome. Because, of course, the majority of refugee hosting worldwide is done by refugees and by other migrant groups. And any of us who are part of a host community that's removed from that migrant experience are kidding ourselves if we think we're really putting ourselves out or know how to do it at all. The majority of the sofas in the rooms, certainly of refugees that I know, are inhabited by new arrivals waiting to get safety and being signposted. There's another sense of the killjoy that Sarah Ahmed talks about. She talks about this aspect of critical consciousness, this punctuating of notions even such as kindness or well-being with a little bit of a critical edge as being vital to opening out our lives, to making more room for life, to maybe making ourselves a little uncomfortable so that there's a new possibility, a different chance. It might mean we have to decreate ourselves in the language of Simone Weil. And she says if ethics is to preserve the freedom to disagree with things, the freedom that is also the right of the man who sat next to me on the plane today, the right of free speech to say these things and work these things through, then we have to understand that there is good that can come from the encounters and that too was a gift, if only for me to operate my killjoy critique on today. Sarah Ahmed says maybe we need to rewrite history and the history of happiness, the history of what we mean by well-being, not from the perspective of middle-class bourgeois people like myself who sit on boards and make decisions, as far too many of us do, and in lecture theatres and boards like this, where we are often salaried to make those decisions, but from the point of view of what Sarah Ahmed calls the wretch. Because then those material conditions inform our decision-making. And we can understand what well-being might look like when well-being is a source of resilience, of hope, but also a source of a demand for justice. And that might estrange us from our more familiar notions of well-being in a rather more gentle state. In my own work around this, I've recently written a very short book, and which was great fun to write because it was a short book. I really haven't got time to write long books any longer. And I think we're in an age where we need to write pamphlets. I think the urgencies, certainly in my own country, of the age mean we need things that come through quickly, where we can have a more urgent tone, and where in peacetime, once again, we can go back and reflect and spend longer with our books. And I really wanted to ask myself the question, autoethnographically, of what happens after acceptable people have been welcomed. Not just to look at the resettlement strategies and the welcome strategies, but actually what's the deep, difficult work we do after the welcome? What does it look like to really unsettle ourselves and resettle ourselves and make a society anew? What does integration mean in the understanding from human integral development? That means we're constantly changing and shaping and developing ourselves, that we might be having to do this as a difficult therapeutic act where each fragment of ourselves is given one story at a time, one piece at a time, one little challenge around bags in lockers at a time. What does it mean to ask the question of how people live when it's unacceptable? And how do we then make a new world that we might make well? So decolonizing multilingualism, for me, was a way of asking this question. And I wanted to ask this by really acknowledging that I am someone who is very fluent in many languages, all colonial languages, all which gave me a great deal of well-being and a great deal of opportunity to travel and be cosmopolitan and for people to, adulate my great ability in German and French. Because that was the education policy of the land, the entente cordiale, and the desire of bourgeois people to go on holiday to the south of France. And of course, now the languages I need are Tigrinya and Tagalog and Arabic and Ga and Shona. Those are the languages I need to speak. I need to speak the languages of welcome in my own neighborhood. I need to learn and am beginning to learn Te Reo Māori because you lovely people keep asking me back. So in the book, I tell a number of stories, and one of them is about learning Te Reo Māori and the way in which that desettled and unsettled and remade me in many ways, which were both beautiful and terrifyingly unsettling for who I am and who I come from. But I also wrote 2 sections about the body, about what happens to the body when you are in so much pain that language is stripped from you, and that you may be situated alongside or in those positions of people who have experienced torture in the way Sarah Ahmed speaks of. And the story of putting myself in the hands of a healer who was actually my taxi driver, and I thought that was all he was when I was working in Ghana. But actually, he was a very skilled healer. And when I tore all 3 anterior ligaments in my ankle and couldn't walk, I tore them again. I've done this several times. There's a weakness there. Then, as well as saying he would be able to drive me around more regularly in order for me to do the work I was doing, which was, irony of ironies, leading a dance production for 6 weeks, he would also be able to heal me. And he said, but it will be painful. And over the course of 3 weeks, he subjected me to deep tissue massage on precisely the point where I had been injured. The medical journals all say that if pain allows, then after a week, this will reduce the swelling and you can probably stand and move a lot more quickly. The pain was excruciating. The people sang in my room, rather as I believe might happen in birthing rituals in parts of the world, to help my breath. But within 3 weeks, I was mobile again. I could dance gently and gingerly again. And something happened between us in that relationship of power reversal, of myself putting myself in the hands of a healer who would never normally be able to practice on someone like myself. And he became the leader, the expert. And I became someone from whom he could also learn, because for the first time, he was watching what happened when blood flows, because he could see it through white skin for the first time, and had never been able to see what a ginormous swollen bruise looked like before as it goes through the traffic lights. The other area that I wanted to look at was what happened within my own family as I engaged in decolonizing, if you like, my heart. So a number of years ago, and it's a very long story, a young girl turned up on our doorstep over 10 years ago on International Women's Day. A young unaccompanied minor from Eritrea. And she was destitute and homeless, and she was an asylum seeker. And she came to live with us, and within 48 hours, we realized that we had a daughter. And over many years, through many different ways of trying to live her life and with her and alongside her, we were able to return to Khartoum, to where the city where her family were housed in a third country. So we met them again for the first time. And so I was very nervous, of course, because we had very little language in common. And I wanted to think about what it meant to be with your daughter who doesn't speak her mother's tongue in order to meet her mother whose tongue she speaks. A young man met us with a small minibus at the airport. When I first knew him, he had a rickshaw. Now he's been here long enough to have a van, said my daughter. My body is already everybody's property. In the minibus, the women who met us are holding my arms, my knee, my face, patting me repeatedly. My skin belongs to their care now. We do not share many words, and so touch and smiles and nods are going to bind us through the time we are spending physically together. And this isn't going to be a time when personal space is maintained and organized the way it is back home. We are going to be living in close quarters and on top of each other by any measure. Along the landing and into the apartment block is a trail of red rose petals and tiny tea-light candles leading into a room with one huge bed for all of us. At the end of the line of lights and petals are the words spelled out in rose petals too. Welcome. Travel weary as we are, not least from using airlines and operators which fly into majority refugee hosting contexts and standing in queues for visa forms and visas and complying with varieties of copycat bureaucratic processes designed to mimic Western ways, it will still be 4 a.m. before the joyous celebrations of arrival end and we can fall into bed. As we enter the apartment, the camera phones are already recording the moment. The endless kissing of cheeks and holding of arms, shoulders, hair, cheeks, and repeated greetings of peace. How are you? Salam. Salam. Peace. How are you? Salam. Peace. How are you? And then that's it for English for 2 weeks. I'm over the threshold and the languages are only Tigrinya and Bilan. And it's beautiful. The petals, the scarves fluttering, the colours telling of who we are with and where they belong. The candlelight bringing us to a place as a home, a welcoming. I want to give you a couple more examples of the things that have gone on within the hosting that has been done in our community and through the work we've been doing in Glasgow together collectively and from the university. So first of all, just to show you this lovely slide of the Red Road Flats, which are no more. The Red Road Flats were demolished recently. But these were one of the places where the majority of asylum seekers and refugees were housed in the city. The City Council wanted to blow them up in a great celebration for the start of the Commonwealth Games. And there was a huge outcry because people felt that blowing these terrible houses up, which were a scene of damp and dreadful health indicators, was just not fair to the lives that had been lived there. The first place of sanctuary, a place where a child was born, the place where the songs and lullabies would be sung. And so instead, we were invited by the community to come and engage in a really interesting art project. One of the things that you see outside Glasgow tenement flats are drying greens with great bed sheets drying together and women and men coming together to hang the washing out there and chat and talk. So in the schools, the children dyed bed sheets different colours. And then SafeDem, the demolition company, hung them up to see what they'd look like on the flats after they'd taken out the asbestos ready for demolition. And they looked like prayer flags from Tibet. And then they recorded songs from the communities that had lived there, lullabies that they'd sung to the children, or other songs, less lullaby-like You Canna Shove Your Granny Aff a Bus. And they played them, after recording them, through the windows of what is, if you look at it very closely, clearly a giant loudspeaker or ghetto blaster to the city. And then a choir came together to do, and I never thought I would say these words in my academic career, Mongolian throat singing. And they were taught to do Mongolian throat singing to find in their stomachs a sound that they associated with the lives they'd lived in those flats, and to bring them together just into a sound that was polyphony and harmony all at once, and under a very skilled conductor to sing goodbye to the flats and to go through lament into joy, to do in song that killjoy that Sarah Ahmed and Lauren Berlant talk about, to lament it, but also to celebrate the lives that had been lived there. Through the work we've been doing that's refugee-led and migrant-led, we've managed to get the key symbols, the civic institutions to not just pretend they have a diversity strategy and count the number of faces of people from different backgrounds they think have come over the threshold in order to keep their public money, but to actually reorganize and reorder their galleries. Yes, to repatriate art that we took, but also to allow artists in Glasgow who are from the diaspora to make art out of artifacts that are in the galleries. So this is a beautiful kente cloth wedding dress made by the same artist who made my beautiful jacket, which is indeed a research output, Nadensu Atodro. And the light box made by Tanim Al-Musawi and Tawana Sitole, that is a long praise poem to the land and ecology of Zimbabwe, now part of the permanent collection in the most visited museum in the whole of Scotland. We let Gaza teach back. We let those in Gaza tell us, as part of the work they were doing with us, wanting to come for refuge but not being allowed, tell us what refuge looked like for them, and to put on a really surprising display of joy that would counter the mainstream media that suggests that all is only devastation and bombing. And we asked the Royal Society of Edinburgh not just to partner with a country in the global south, particularly in Africa for the first time in its 300-year history since the Enlightenment, but to consider drawing pictures of the refugee background scholars that had recently been elected as fellows to the Royal Academy through a particular scheme we did with our Scholars at Risk event. And this will be really pertinent to the event going on, I know, at Vic tomorrow. This is a portrait of Deborah Kayembe, a barrister from DR Congo. It is the first time a black woman has been displayed on the walls of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It was unveiled by the head of the art school, and it now hangs in the permanent collection of the Royal Society of Edinburgh as part of the Edinburgh Festival. And next to that is my colleague Alana, standing next to the Human Rights Commissioner for the United Nations, the High Commissioner. The dignity and the pride that comes when a talented portrait artist, Ian Campbell, sits down with people and says to them, the most painted person in the world is the Queen. Let's put your portrait on the walls of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So I'm coming to the end of what I want to say to you. And I really want to say that the epic story that we're living through again, it's not unprecedented. There are no more numbers of refugees than there really have been at other times of history. And if you're told it's unprecedented, it's by organizations that know that that's one way to just make sure they can keep doing humanitarian aid work, or one way that they can keep frightening you about refugees. But it is a story of movement, and it is a time where fear is reaching very high levels again. And as a result, it's also a story of resistance and well-being that goes on beyond welcome. And I think for us all to be well, we maybe need to learn from what exiles do. And what exiles do, and we know this from theologians, and we know this from health professionals, we know this from educators, and we know this from researchers, and we know this from artists. What exiles do is they grieve, they lament. They make public their expressions of pain, and without apology. They are honest about their sadness. They ridicule established structures of power, and they don't, and please don't ask people to do this, they don't spend all their time being grateful. It is a right to seek asylum. They're careful about being too cozy with empire, and they're careful about empire's language. They tackle the dominant and failing script with words of their own. And they remember the elements, the things of the land that are universal, that bind us all. The old ways, the old names, the odd ways, the odd names, like well and wall and wall and walla, and all those roots that might tell us something about what we mean when we say well-being. The odd things, the quirky things, the things that are the stock trade of artists and those with prophetic imaginations in order to reimagine the future. And it's in this way that I believe well-being as integration is hospitality. It's so much more than welcoming people with the plastic toys that you don't want anymore. It's costly, and if it doesn't change us, if it's not a bit uncomfortable, if we don't have to make a bit more room in the overhead locker, then it isn't welcome, and it isn't hospitality. And it's not, and it's already breaking that taboo, which is one of the deepest we have, about failing to offer hospitality to the stranger. And this is what I've come to understand as what's at the root of Manaakitanga. We are well because you have come. You bring wellness to us. This is your gift. Because we will have to reimagine what happiness means when we have to move our bags in an overhead locker. And that is why from the well, the source, the water, we also greet people with water. Every time I land in Accra or Khartoum, the first thing I get is one of these. And one day it won't be in a plastic bottle. Greetings with water, baptism, the dipping, the throwing of bodies into the river, the things I've experienced in Te Oroara, when to cleanse me of the heaviness I might carry, I too have been thrown into a river from the mountains in May. Thankfully, I swim off the coast of Iona in Scotland, so I know how quickly you can go blue in that water. Wellness, not just the wellness of well-being, but the wellness of the well, the water, those mystical qualities again. So hospitality, I believe, is for our well-being, of remaking a culture as reciprocity. It is integral to life, and it's both a human and a spiritual taboo to break it. If you break it, you break everything, the bonds that bind us. So there is a well in well-being, depending on water, on its ebb and its flow, its life-sustaining and life-giving qualities. We commit ourselves to learning about it because that way, as Elaine Scarry says, if we know about well-being in its deep ways and its critical ways, we will know where to stand when something beautiful happens, like when a comet makes its sweep across the sky. We're obedient to other minds, other principles, other elements. Seamus Heaney said, "The way we are living, timorous or bold, will have been our life." Are you the interpreter? Asks the anaesthetist. Two surgeons arrive. Are you the interpreter? No, I laugh. I'm the mum. You're too young. Quick as a flash and not a blink of hesitation. And I'm so grateful. And not for the compliment, but for the lack of a flinch. They have the widest of smiles, and I am in a European minority of 1 to 3 Africans. And for once, it's a relief. The nurse tells me to go off for a walk if I like. I go into town. High Street is the usual door-end forgottenness, straining at hope that it has been since I first arrived in the city. A few swanky buildings, a tourist infill precinct around the cathedral, but it's this mural of St. Mungo, with his kindly face and robin, that brings me warmth and speaks of the refuge I too feel at times in the complicated, flourishing, suffering city of Glasgow. Today is the autumn equinox. It's the day when the light of summer gives way to the light of the winter to come. The day when day and night are in equal measure. From the hospital ward, the skies to the east as dawn broke filled me up. Blue, gleaming grey. Today is the first time I've ever been to the necropolis. So I wander up among the urns and angels under the spire of the cathedral and red buried rowan trees, guardians of life and death. They say that rowan crosses were placed on the lintels of houses in the past as protection, that it was from the rowan tree that the first woman was made. Fanny, with Mungo in arms, looks down from another mural on High Street, a survivor of rape, a name among many names, Enoch, Tenu, Thanu, Thanoia, for a day when names matter and are made anew. I look across from the necropolis towards Lothian, from whence she came, Fanny, cast adrift in a coracle in the Forth, having been thrown out of her father's high house after the rape led to pregnancy. Today is the International Day for Peace. And my heart yearns for the easing of border controls, which mean that those who should be here in my place are not being mistaken for an interpreter and might have been granted a visitor visa. But this is the time of reality, of the hostile environment and a war which relentlessly divides families, friends and loved ones, and does so most acutely when you stand on the thresholds of life and death. So we make the best of it. People are kind and everyone is promising joy. I've learned over the years of living this way to feel little at times by way of emotion. There is a protection, like a little like the robin's sharp song, which draws my feelings into a tight curl and fits them into a shell. I know that hope means being quiet in this small, dark, solitary place. Because a baby will be born, and its life too will wither like the trees, turning on the branches of the rowan. Perhaps today, perhaps after 70 years and 10. There is nothing certain in life except death, taxes, and for this generation, hostile border controls. Many names and many roles are needed in the waging and keeping of peace, for the sustaining of hospitality in a hospital over the long term and beyond the welcome. All day I have been an interpreter of the symbols of peace around this hospital in my home city, the city of my own refuge and sheltering, of my mothering and fostering. Here is the bird that never flew, the tree that never grew, the bell that never rang, the fish that never swam. We're ready, says the nurse. The day has been long and the surgeons are working late. Time passes and passes. And then there is a miracle in my arms. And what are you going to be called? Asks the kind-faced nurse. Abai, grandma. The words stumble out like life, like peace.
Enter the wild with care, my love, and speak the things you see. Let new names take and root and thrive and grow. And even as you travel far from heather, crag and river, may you, like the little fisher, set the stream alight with glitter. May you enter now as otter, without falter, into water. Look to the sky with care, my love, and speak the things you see. Let new names take and root and thrive and grow. And even as you journey on, past dying stars exploding like the gilded one in flight, leave your little gifts of light. And in the dead of night, my darling, find the gleaming eye of starling, like the little aviator. Sing your heart to all dark matter. sing the things you see. Let new names take a root and thrive and grow. And even as you stumble through Macher sands eroding, let the fern unfurl your grieving. Let the heron still your breathing. Let the sadness swim you deep. Even as the hour grows bleaker, be the singer and the speaker, and in city and in forest, let the larks become your chorus. And where every hope is gone, let the raven call you home.
Professor Alison, thank you for your presentation. When you talk about refugee migrant, Christianity is a Western religion. The fundament of Western civilization is based on Christianity. But now we have multiculturalism. When we take in refugees, they can have any background. And refugees are migrants. We also have migrants for other countries. Now, the question is, when there is multi-faith, different religion, different belief, when you start practicing Christian, it's some kind of hostility. Because I believe in loving God, loving parents, maintaining peace, and the country provide space for refugee to fit in, and also for migrant to come in to work and to live and to study. But what happens if we don't aim for conversion, but we aim for understanding, to accommodate people that practice Christianity, to love God in Puritan, in many ways? So what is your opinion?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think understanding is a really important element in the kinds of peace building that we need in order to make well and flourishing societies. But I don't think understanding is enough. I think understanding is one of the things we need. But I think you can understand a lot with your mind, but still engage in actions that are unkind, unjust, and which won't enable the kinds of societies that you're describing. I think it is right that one of the things, but only one of the things that is part of what might be a basis for you claiming the right to be recognized as a refugee is religious persecution from whatever religious background that might be. But I also think it's right that there are other elements and dimensions to that. And they often come into conflict with one another. So there are elements in some of the world religions that do not recognize the right to claim asylum and be recognized as a refugee on the grounds of your sexuality. And that then means that in the societies we're trying to build, we've got a really difficult job to do. And I do believe that some of what you're working out in tricky ways here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, with your bicultural and your bilingual strategies and your understanding, your relatively new understanding or revitalized understanding of what it means to live under the treaty is one thing that you have as a gift for the world in understanding this. That actually tolerance, understanding and allowing people to live within the law in ways which are accepted is important. And acceptance and understanding does not have to be the same as full agreement and full consensus. And I think we often mix up the two. We think we all have to agree to live together, and we don't. In fact, we know that from our own families, and I certainly know it from my family, that basically the people I love the most are the people with whom I can have the most profound disagreements. And my goodness, do I understand them. You know, I've done the therapy course, I've read the manuals, I know what my mother's childhood trauma was, and still understanding doesn't help me when she asks me why I don't know where the butter knife is kept at home. And when, so I think, there are other factors that we need within the ways we live together. A very wise psychotherapist said to me once, we can't change anything without humor. And that if we can live with one another in a way where we can make light of some of the things we do, then we will be able to live with one another. And that's particularly hard in the context where we're talking about faith and religious practice, because we're so easily offended. We are so easily offended. I remember The Life of Brian coming out as a film when I was in my teenagers and people were picketing outside. We are so easily offended. And to me, what we need, if we take offense so easily, we may as well forget that and wait for the God to come along who is strong enough to take it. Because I don't know about you, but the different gods that I've experimented with or worshipped in my life, they've got quite a sense of humour. I mean, they must have, because you guys keep inviting me back. Yeah.
I was just wondering, have you come across the documentary Celia? Celia Lashley, the documentary made by Amanda Miller?
No, I haven't.
So it's
it sounds like I should.
Amazing. You should. So it's just to say, in there's a lovely young girl. Well, she was 12 at the time, so it's a few years, isn't it, since? But I think she had a Syrian granny. And so when Celia died, her really good friend was neighbours with this family. And it's really beautiful because it links into a different Syrian story. And there's makefoundation.org. And she sings this most beautiful song. So there's that. And just going along with, how we're blessed to have the Māori culture. Yeah. So sort of like links in a bit with mental health and well-being, which is all in our budget and that this year. I've written it down. Don't worry, I'll give you my notes.
Great. I can put my pen down.
So there's this mental health written from a Māori perspective. So it's called hearingvoices.org, not New Zealand. And so it's sort of saying you've got to take things from a cultural perspective. So what happens is we have a lot of psychiatrists come to New Zealand because there's a shortage, I believe. So what happens is they're coming with their European mindset and they don't get like someone like me. I'm white as, I'm a Pākehā, but I grew up in Porirua. So it's normal for me to ask, who are your people? Where are you from? Yeah. And to ask that of a psychiatrist from the UK, they don't get it because, they might be working class, work their way up, and it's like you're sort of questioning, Absolutely. Are they worthy? Yeah. That's what I've done recently. That's actually quite funny that you've raised that because in the Carl Lecture 7, I was looking at the work we've been doing on mental health within my team, particularly looking at the way in which we've been decreating and decolonizing that mental health mindset within research and working with my colleague, particularly Ross White, but also Roscoe Kasuja from Makerere University in Uganda, and doing some work with a dance company in Ghana to really deconstruct the framework of understanding of random control trials and of research that's been done largely on, I think, second-year undergraduate students in American universities, which is the basis for how we have learned to do mental health. And I'm looking at Marika there, who's nodding away as well. But that just doesn't tell you anything, and it's not helpful to us for actually working across a number of different contexts and cultures for the work we're doing. And I think what we've found is when we've worked particularly from Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous sayings and Indigenous knowledge, that there is an enormous wealth of wisdom embedded, particularly in proverbs, that are used to enable people to stay well and to facilitate their own well-being, and that, the vast majority of the world's population can't afford to see or visit somebody for counselling. And even if the vast majority of the world's population could, what would be imposed on them would not necessarily be something that was of any value to anyone other than second year undergraduate student. I'm exaggerating for effect, but you get the point. So at some point, I think that lecture will be online, and we've done a couple of projects that we can trade notes for that.
Yes, Alison, thank you for that inspirational, very moving talk. And lots of resonances for me. I come from a Scottish father who left Glasgow in 1930 because he thought it was the most appalling place ever, and then met my mother, who was a Jewish German refugee in Cairo, and a mother who lived in Palestine and hated with a passion what was happening to the Palestinians. But I've got two very simple questions. One is, what did you say to the man with the overhead locker incident? Because I can think, this is what I'd have said, and I know actually what I've done, I'd have gone, oh, I'm not going to say anything, this is too embarrassing, as a good Brit. But I'm interested to know what you said to him. And the second thing is, what, if you had a magic wand and could design a policy for the European Union borders, what would that be? Because it's, I mean, just like a swamp of how do you get there? I don't know. So one simple question, and one will take you next.
What did I say? So what I said was, would you mind if I moved past you? I would like to go to the toilet. And there's a bit of me that thinks I should have challenged him. But I think if I had done, my friends who were sitting behind me, who I'd been chatting to, who were of the Syrian refugee family, I think I was mindful of their sense of discomfort. And I've been in many, many situations where I have chosen to speak up, but I've been in many situations where I've chosen not to because I'm trying to work out, or because I'm unsure. I come from Yorkshire, when in doubt, do note. And there was doubt in my head. But there was also the sense of, that phrase about, the kind-faced woman on the subway makes room. And I thought, everything about you is saying you don't want to make room for these people, their belongings or anything else. So I'm going to ask you to make room for me. I'm going to ask you to allow me to move past you so I can be more comfortable. And if you can do that, then we can start, because we've got a place. And I did wonder, I mean, given the tirade I was hearing coming from him, I did wonder whether he would actually allow me to move past him. And he did moan and grumble a bit, but it did happen. And then when I sat down again, he took my seatbelt, not his. And so we ended up with a moment where we had humour. And then we didn't get into conversation, but there was a moment where we could begin that work. So I think very subtle micro movements, but that's what I said. I said, can I get past you because I'd like to go to the toilet? So, water in, water out. Increasingly, and following the scholarship of a number of people, but also legal scholars that I work with, I pretty much advocate for human beings with good immunisation programs or treatment programs overseas, freedom of movement. I actually think borders are the problem. I think they're hugely expensive. They don't work. They produce more fear. And what we see in the vast majority of the parts of the world where people can move across borders relatively freely is that after the initial moment of mass flight, which occasionally happens and therefore is all over the news so everyone thinks it's normal, but isn't. After that, and after it's regularised and UNHCR go in and they build their camps and those things can happen and it's contained, people move very quickly into wanting to put this into normal life and to establish normal life. And that in the majority of the world's populations, people just move across borders quite freely and establish new places, and new settlements grow and develop and change. The people who are odd are those of us in the West, although there's a wonderful meme map of the West going all over the world at the moment. The West is South Africa and North America, and this is the West too. So, but in these places, the rich world, the world that has exploited well for its own benefit, we're really scared that people might come and take what we've got. So my sense would be freedom of movement within Europe is working, and it's working for refugees too, who arrive and then can get to the country to claim asylum where their families are. It's difficult, but it's possible, and that's a good thing for everybody. So my sense is, let's just let it happen. I mean, the other policy I would have right now, because it's not going to happen anytime soon, not in my lifetime, people are too scared, and there's too much money tied up with the border politics and the border infrastructures. A lot of people are making a lot of money from corporations like G4S
and we shouldn't underestimate that. You want to know why we do this? Follow the money. But safe passage. We would not have the deaths we've got if we were doing refugee resettlement well, and it's great that you are over doubling the quota here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The numbers we take are pitiful. The numbers, of course, that are crossing into countries where the border controls don't exist, the millions in Turkey and in Lebanon and in Jordan and in Uganda. What can we say? I mean, it can only be a source of shame and challenge to us. So that would be my policy. Safe passage. All the gates and the borders, they're all gone away.
We're pretty much out of time. Is there any final question for this scripture for one more? One last question.
The Economist has recently done a report on global migration, and they talk a lot about the economic benefits of freedom of movement and how you can. They predict that open borders would double the global GDP. How comfortable do you feel using those arguments? Because I'm guessing that they also clash with certain beliefs that you might hold about the world economy and things like that.
So if they are the only arguments that are used, I'm very uncomfortable. But I'm not. I'm also a pragmatist. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to make money, we need to have good employment. There are many things we need. So the fact that a spin-off from having what is right might be that there is more real wealth for all, then I don't really have a problem with it. What I do have a problem with is the use of arguments of contribution that are made for why we should take refugees in. I think those are, they are absolutely not in the spirit of the United Nations Convention, which is you have a right, if you are persecuted, you have a right to seek asylum, full stop. Not if you're persecuted and you come from a particular group that have a high human capital index and you may have already gone through higher education, so therefore we'll take you in. And that is a lot of the time, many of the Syrian refugees, and one of the ways in which some of the European policies have worked, to say, we'll take the Syrians, but we won't take the Eritreans, because higher education in Eritrea closed completely in 2003, so therefore we'll have to put a lot more time and effort into educating people. That's pernicious. That's unjust. No. But if it's about saying what has also happened in a number of countries like Germany, where 1 million people were resettled, and I think it was the last I read in The Economist that my father-in-law brought round for me to read. He cuts out the articles he thinks I should look at. There's been a 14% bump in GDP in Germany because of the resettlement. That's not nothing. What you then do with that money, and that's the killjoy question, that's what's important. Myths of scarcity abound. The more we have, the more we think other people are coming for it. Whereas actually Deinu was what we learned in the past from a myth, from the idea that we have enough as long as we work out a wheel, a commonwealth, a common wheel, a way of sharing it in common, holding it in common. So for me, yep, it's great if we all get an awful lot richer, twice as much as a result of freedom of movement, but if we spend it on nuclear weapons, as my country is doing, or if we spend it on building a great big wall across Mexico, as the 45th President of the United States of America thinks he should do, and propping up the profits of massive global multinational corporations, I really don't think it's a good idea. I think that was quite clear, wasn't it?